Welcome to Trust Talk. Today our guest, Antoinette Weibel, takes us into the world of trust and different types of control, from coordination to surveillance, and how this impacts trust within a workplace. She uncovers the balance between enabling and coercive controls, and how even bureaucracy can play a positive role in fostering trust. She also sheds light on the evolving role of HR, emphasizing the importance of trust in employer-employee relationships and the need for HR practices that truly support and dignify employees. Moreover, Weibel distinguishes between distrust and low trust, highlighting their significant effects on organizational dynamics. Finally, she discusses the crucial role of research and consultancy in authentically building trust, advocating for engaged scholarship and ethical practices. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Welcome to Trust Talk, Antoinette. We are eager to hear about your journey in trust research. Can you tell us what sparked your enthusiasm for this field and how it led you to your current position?
Okay, I think I have two answers for that. One is the proper one, and the other one I think sounds better and is a little bit more why I'm still enthusiastic. So the first one is my former supervisor, Margaret Osterloh, is married to Bruno Frey, is a very known economist, and he told her, your new PhD student has to do something on trust. So, that was really why I started my PhD thesis on trust.
And when was that?
Well, that was in 1995. So a very long time ago. I really started early with trust research. And I think what is really, if I look back at all my research, the underlying thread is that I always wanted to have delightful organizations, where I believe we have suffering machines more than delightful organizations. And so I started to look at all the nice stuff like trust, intrinsic motivation, thriving, and well-being. And now, finally, I arrived almost at a normative theory, not almost. Now I'm looking at good work in good organizations. But maybe we come to that, why I switched a little bit from more descriptive research to normative research later.
I want to cover a few subjects that you have been focusing on in your research. So let's start with your exploring the relationship between trust and control across various domains like strategic alliances, employer-employee relationships, and leadership. The relationship between trust and control was not yet a subject in my podcast, so I'm very curious.
That's interesting because you had already Sim and many others on here. But maybe that's because I am originally trained as an economist. And I told you already that I started my PhD in 1995. And then all the theories were full with, you always have to assume the worst. So people are opportunistic. They want to betray you, even with guile. Trust only belongs to private relationship. In economic transactions, we need calculativeness. And so we could say that for economists, carrot and sticks and controls, that's really what matters. And at the same time, other theories popped up, which had a little bit of a more humanistic man model, be it stewardship theory instead of principal agency theory, or transaction value, where we would look at collective value creation just rather than transaction cost. And here it was all about trust. So it was about trust rocks. And then already I thought, but that's a little bit strange because common sense tells us we probably need both. We need trust and control. That's how we usually see our relationships. And there was also young science at that time, now of course much better known, behavioral economics, which also showed you need both trust and control for a solid cooperation. So I was kind of starting them from the assumption, could it be that certain type of controls or what type of controls can make trust even better? Can we understand a little bit more how these two variables have a positive interaction? At the beginning, I was really very much looking into the type of controls. For instance, it makes a huge difference whether you need control more for coordination so that people are able to get the information to cooperate with each other, or if you use it more with a surveillance mind, which is often the case. And it also makes a huge difference if you have enabling controls or coercive controls. So enabling being practical, helpful, participative types of controls, whereas coercive is really just telling you what to do, and often it's not even very helpful. These were just few of the characteristics I looked at the beginning. But if you look at the type of control which makes trust better, you end up with something which I believe is still interesting for people today. You find out that bureaucracy can in fact be good for trust. So it can have positive effects on trust. Rules, procedural controls, process controls, we found that are more enabling and more helpful to create trust between two parties.
I'm a lawyer by training, and you are an economist, and we both have the same in our education and in our system. Control is essential, right?
Exactly. And I mean, as a lawyer, although not always lawyers are interested in that, but it depends how you create the laws for the reactions you get. So if there are laws which are creating fairness, which is a very important thing, and that's the same for controls, then that already is a good thing for trust between people. Or also you can produce more reliability because there is a certain kind of framework. You can clarify expectations. So these are all aspects which are positive for trust and which need to be also understood, because you can mindlessly bash bureaucracy, which some people are doing right now. I'm not naming them, but there are even very popular management bestsellers right now, which are all about let's get rid of bureaucracy. And I think it's not so easy, because some part of the bureaucracy and of the controls are really needed also for the social fabric.
I'm sure that this is a subject we can talk about a whole podcast if we want. But I would like to also cover some other aspects that you have been focusing on, and that is human resources, or HR. Our listeners are likely familiar with the need for a trustful relationship between an employer and an employee. That sounds logical, a topic that is also covered in many business publications. So what prompted you to explore this subject further, and can you summarize in general terms your key findings?
So again, a huge question, but maybe quickly go back to, it's clear, or we would assume that this is very important. And you say there's a lot of practitioner literature, but in fact, at least in 2010, when we had our first publication, there was rarely any literature in HR really looking at trust, for instance, in the employer, or what has it got to do with HR. So that's quite striking, isn't it?
It is.
There are several explanations, but I think one is interesting because it still has consequences today. And that is that HR research, but not only research, also practice, has progressed in the last 20 years. And we can discuss whether this is a progression from a more employee champion and operational role to a strategic business partner role. And what that also means is that one was much more interested how certain strategic HR practices, be it, for instance, performance management, would contribute to the profit of the company. So the whole research was really about, can we find the holy grail? What instruments in HR to use in order to augment profits and organizational performance? And of course, here in this quest, a lot of things were not looked at and were also lost. And I just looked it up for an HR conference. A consequence of that is now that HR as a function is the least trusted function in the company at present, according to the Edelman Trust Barometers, but also others. And if we look in what was happening, not so much in Europe or in the Rhinelands, but in the Anglo-Saxon world, when we had this great resignation and the conscious quitting waves, then we find what the number one reasons were. And they all had to do with markers of suspicion or distrust in the employment relationships rather than trust. So it was all about micromanaging bosses, toxic and abusive workplaces, and the confidence, again, that's an Edelman finding, that CEOs would lie on a regular basis. So it is an important topic, but it seems we haven't taken that very seriously, neither in research, although there's, of course, a little bit more now, nor really in practice. So maybe that's something. And I'm not sure whether I went into very practical nitty-gritty things now, but maybe I already said a little bit into that.
Yeah, we can come to that a little later, because you told me also that you especially looked into trust in relation to the employer. Why did you choose especially that side?
Well, I think, first of all, when we did that again, I mean, that's also certain years ago now when we started this, there was very little knowledge about trust in systems and very little knowledge on multi-level trust. And then I also found that interesting because from the point of view of the employee, of course, the employer is the central figure, so to say, because we're all to a certain degree on the mercy of our employers. And I think growingly so, because now we often have the case that employers only define a very small group as core employees, so they get all the goodies. And the rest always has to fear that they're potentially replaceable or outsourced, so to say, on platforms. And hence, here they often, of course, feel vulnerable, especially towards the employer. And it's very hard to gauge whether this employer is trustworthy because it's a system. There are so many touch points. So you have the direct supervisors, and they're chosen by selection practices. You have the senior and top management as representatives of the organizations. And of course, all the social structures of the company, like its performance and promotion system, or how and whether employees are developed very well. And you have to look at all of this if you want to find out how trust in the employer is generated and also upheld.
Maybe because we just mentioned examples, maybe this is good to go into that. Are you aware of specific HR initiatives that have successfully built or restored trust, especially in difficult or challenging situations?
Well, I mean, we looked at this more particularly in the context of new technologies, and I think we're going to touch that later. So I'm going to be a little bit more general. I think that organizations really need to demonstrate their own goodwill and competences through two avenues, through their values and ideals. So really, what are guidelines, for instance, how we will use new technologies, or on what guidelines do we judge the performance of employees? So, I mean, all these important things which later are important for employees, whether they are thriving in a company or not. And at the same time, that's not enough. So words, values, and ideas are extremely important, but it's clearly not enough. But you also have to really invest. It's not only cheap talk. You have to show them, for instance, we do not only talk about empowerment, but we have formal participation. We have employees sitting as representatives on the board or something like that. I mean, we know that a little bit in our systems, but that's not everywhere in the world. So as HR, you have to really show that you have this view for the employees. I would even call it a humanization view. On the other hand, it's even more important that this is also then ingrained in the structure. So maybe abolish certain types we are using in performance management. Rank or yank systems are really bad for a number of reasons and destroy trust very quickly. So, I mean, that would be a good one to rebuild trust or to really signal we also care about you and not about the profit only. So we could really go through the whole employee life cycle, HR practices, and always would have to ask, is this clearly signaling to the employees you are a person of dignity, we want you to flourish, we want you to be able to contribute to the cooperative value creation? Or is this more a signal that we're saying you're just a number, at the end all what matters is the profit and the shareholder value?
It's very interesting because just this morning I read a tweet from a woman who told that she worked for 22 years at the same company and she only got a warm hand and a thank you, not even a flower, not a small party. And so you wonder what kind of image does that give to the colleagues that are still at the company? What kind of HR is that? Anyway, in the field of HR, as organizations start integrating more advanced AI, you just mentioned it, particularly generative AI, into their workflows, what do you think is the most critical issue they need to address? Specifically, how should they balance the efficiency on the one hand of AI with ensuring that employees feel valued and not replaced or marginalized by these technologies?
Two things on a more higher level. First of all, we, at least in research, we should not only understand what is strengthening trust in technology, but it's more important here how this technology changes the social fabric in organizations. So we have to make sure that it's not crowding out, again, the humanity in organizations. That also then, for me, clearly spells out what organizations should do. they have to really credibly show and invest in that we use technology to create a more humane workplace. So, as I said, allowing employees to flourish rather than to automate them away, for instance. That was in all technology waves we had, in all industrialization phases we had. It was always this fight, and only the organizations, the high road organizations, which really use the technology in a different fashion, in the end could keep the trust. But what's even more important, I think that's also the decent way to go about it. So if organizations are not doing it this way, maybe at some stage governments will step in and say, you have to use technology in that way.
Let's move to another subject. You often write about some conceptual challenges, particularly about distinguishing distrust from trust or low trust. What is the difference, and how, in your view, because we have been talking about that in previous podcasts, and how does this impact, say, the way we interact?
Well, I think here I'm completely with Sim, which comes at no surprise because we've written a paper together about that.
You're referring to Sim Sitkin, right? Who we interviewed earlier. Yeah.
Yes, Sim Sitkin. Yeah. For me, it's clear distrust is qualitatively hugely different from trust, and we should really make that difference, because once distrust has entered the relationship, it very quickly crowds out any goodwill. So it crowds out the basis for further trust, because it leads to avoidance of interaction. I don't want to see or hear the other person any longer. And if that's not possible, to conflicts, even to the so-called intractable conflicts. And you asked me how I would define distrust. I now put it into layman terms, because then it maybe gets clearer. For me, it's the unwillingness to be vulnerable, based on the conviction that the other is out to get me. So I'm really making this very strongly, but I think this is what it's all about. And we can show that in lab research, that you have a different brain system on. So you're in the fight and flight mode. You have a different hormonal system. So it's really not oxytocin that's gone in that moment, but it's a lot of aggressive hormones going on. And I believe when other researchers say that trust and distrust can coexist, they make a confusion, sorry to say so, because they confuse distrust with suspicion. Suspicion is the situation where I doubt the other, where I have conflicting hypotheses. Maybe that person is trustable, maybe not. That sometimes can even be healthy. It certainly is not destructive. But distrust is, and I can also get quite passionate that we really have to use this distinction despite any silly power play you have in our journals, because everybody wants to defend their, but I said it differently. And I can give you maybe 2 examples in our big stakeholder distrust research. So we looked at big companies who created big troubles and were really then in the field almost of distrust. So almost every stakeholder distrusted them. We could show that if you conceptualize it properly as a different construct, then you are able to see different things. You're all of a sudden able to see tipping points. So this is important for companies to see, oh, wow, if I'm now going on like that, then we are going into a very different phase and can hardly get out of that any longer. So it's important for this one. And it's also important for companies and for research, of course, as well, to explore and create distrust containing practices, because I told you it's very difficult. It creates this downward spiral, and we need to understand how can we at least stop that spiral, let alone before we can even think about maybe really distrust reversal. And the thing is, neither in research, at least not in management research, nor in practice, we know a lot about these practices. You really have to go to conflict mediators in war. They might have these practices, but companies need them too. And that's why I get a little bit passionate and say here, why not assume it's really different? And I think we even have the data for that. And then find out what the real life consequences is. Because I think that is what research should be all about. That we are not fighting about concepts, but really understand what we can learn if we conceptualize it differently.
You mentioned already vulnerability. I covered that in a previous podcast with Nicole Gillespie, one of your colleagues. A subject that seems to get more interest and trust research. What are your ideas about the role of vulnerability, and Maybe you can start telling us what we actually mean by vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, you guide me very nicely, and now you get first another rant. But I'm being careful. You know, I was president of FINT for a long time, and then you sometimes also are seeing the field and have the feeling, why are we not moving more quickly? And here I just want to say that it took us 25 years after these first seminal trust works, books and articles on trust to really unpack vulnerability. And it's the core of what we say. We always talk about a willingness to be vulnerable. That would be trust. So you would think that this is a field who knows such a lot about vulnerability, when in reality, we really know very little. And I think it needed outsiders like Brené Brown. You certainly know her bestseller about vulnerability and her TED Talk, or also Amy Edmondson, which usually she doesn't want to touch trust because she does psychological safety. And both of them were very hard and hammered on, you really have to understand vulnerability, and that's important. We have to understand how to also make ourselves vulnerable in the, for instance, more powerful position as a leader to become better leaders. So I think my plaidoyer thus would be no thought restrictions. Let's really go back to the drawing table, be open, set aside maybe Mayor Davis Gorman, again, one of the big articles we have in our field, and be open for the vast insight on vulnerabilities even within trust research. So, for instance, Morten Deutsch in the 50s, for him, vulnerability was being cognizant that you're at the mercy of. Because you are cognizant that you are at the mercy of somebody, you then start to look for trust cues. So it's a slightly different way to look at it. But we should also go to other areas. And for instance, I give you just one example because I think it's huge. And in the future, you might have more people hopefully doing research on that. Antoinette Weibel, she is a moral philosopher. She looks at the so-called socio-emotional vulnerability, which is a vulnerability which is based on the fact that we are human beings, and human beings need other human beings to learn, to develop, to prosper. So she's having a relational ontology. She says we cannot think about a human being alone. You always have to see a person in connections. Because we need others, we are always vulnerable. We are vulnerable that other peoples are having goodwill towards us, helping us to develop, giving us feedback, carrying us to a certain degree. And she says that creates an ethical obligation. The person who is more powerful, or the system who is more powerful in a relationship, should be beneficent and caring. So she uses vulnerability even to create the insight of moral trust. We have to be trustworthy. That's a moral obligation based on that. And then that's just one example. We can look at many other aspects of vulnerability, but I think it just opens the field again and helps us to bring new insights to practice as well.
So if we obtain slowly but steadily a better understanding of the role of vulnerability in building trust, are there some simple tips we can apply how these insights in our everyday interactions, both professional and personal environments, will lead this vulnerability into trust? Because if there is an absence of vulnerability, what happens then in trust?
Well, if you had a complete absence of vulnerability, then we would say at least you do not need trust, because that's just the core. The core is that we are dependent on each other. If we are able to completely strip it away, which some people claim they can do with new technology, we don't need trust any longer. We only need control and transparency in the future. Then I think we also lose humanity. You see, now we're very philosophical, but for me, that's the core you have now just touched. And that means, especially also in these times when new technologies are entering into our organizations, we need to show our human side. And I always say the person who is more powerful in a relationship needs to begin that. And that would be the leader for me. And a leader would have to listen, would have to ask, would have to show also that she doesn't know everything better than her employees. These are so small things, but they're often not practiced in the organization because we learned to lead with bravado, to be the strong man and maybe even now the strong woman.
That's, by the way, a recurring theme in my podcasts about leadership. Another recurring theme in my interviews is the intersection between academic research and practical application in the field of trust. In your opinion, how can trust research and commercial trust consultants mutually benefit from each other, particularly in solving real-world problems?
It's not an easy question. I mean, first of all, how can anybody ever profit from research? And I think for that, research needs to become a little bit more contextual. So we need to reach out to practice. And what I really love is the idea of engaged scholarship. So defining research questions together. So from the beginning, what we are looking at in research might be also more applicable and might be more helpful to practice, and then maybe even work together to a certain degree. But that's the easy part. You were asking me about consultants, and here I'm a little bit split because I find a lot of particularly small consultants, these are really forces for the good and they try to help organizations to transform. I'm, however, very skeptical when it comes to the big consultants. So let me just make it very clear. I would never work with McKinsey together. And probably they also wouldn't work with me, to make it clear. But I mean, trust can be used, but it can also be abused. You can manipulate it. We have written a paper about trust, the poison chalice, where we kind of show that you can manipulate trust talk, tell the employee, you have to trust me. And because they have, in the end, no other chance, they are forced into a certain situation which is all but good for them, and they really don't want to do that. And I mean, the other thing is even more normal. We can pretend to be trustworthy and then abuse people who are trusting us. And I think we just have to be cognizant of that in research and in consulting, that it's not used in a manipulative fashion, but in an authentic fashion. And here I would just say, let's find consultants which have the same mind. By the way, some researchers are not very sensitive to that as well. So also find the right researchers and team up, as I would do it in my project now about good organizations, where I work with a former COO of ING, which I believe is engaged scholarship in the end.
I never heard that term, Antoinette, engaged scholarship, but I like it because it's one of the aims I have with the podcast is to give a whole broad audience insights into the workings of trust, not only to help them to figure out how to best apply all those research results, but also see that trust is a multifaceted concept. It has many faces, it has many aspects, and people like yourself in the academic world, we need them to bring us further in how we can apply that in day-to-day work. Because too often the word trust is used as a generic term and without any meaning. Currently in politics in the Netherlands, the word is used daily, many times per day, basically as an equivalent of belief. Has nothing to do with trust. And I think in order to prevent that the word becomes meaningless, we need to be more forceful in using the academic results of trust research into our day-to-day practice. But there's more a preach than a question, I'm afraid.
Well, 2 reflections on that. Yes, but I also believe that research needs to become more sensitive towards practice and also towards our moral obligations in looking at that topic. So it's a 2-sided street, in my opinion. And the second thing, I just want to thank you, because I think you're very brave going through all these trust researcher, and probably everybody's like me saying, oh, but I want to talk about that article and so on and so forth. But you're really teasing out what might be of interest to the public. And that's a huge and really needed work. So thank you very much from my side as well.
I'm happy that you have contributed, Antoinette. Thank you very much for being our guest and wish you all the best.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.